Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott. Now, as many of you know, I've been working through some of the new, for example, Sigma or Tamron lenses that have been re-released on Fuji X mount, seeing how they hold up to the higher standard of the new 40 megapixel sensor on my XH2. I've been interested in seeing, however, just as a point of comparison, since I've compared and contrasted the Sigma 18 to 50 millimeter versus the Tamron 17 to 70 millimeter, and I drew some conclusions there relative to what I'd seen previously on Sony E-mount. But I was really curious to see how some of Fuji's own standard zoom lenses, most notably the 18 to 55, and then the premium option here, the 16 to 55 millimeter F2.8, and this is RLMWR, and I'll break down what that means in just a moment. I wanted to see how it handles the standard and how my opinion has shifted since my original review. Now, I reviewed the 16 to 55 millimeter basically right on 5 years ago, and it wasn't a new lens at that point. It's just that I was new to Fuji. So I did that on the X-T3, the review I did that, and actually did primarily while traveling to Myrtle Beach. Now, ironically, 5 years later, I had planned another trip to Myrtle Beach, so I thought, let's redo this review. Let's take a look at how it holds up. The lens itself was actually released back in 2015, and so it is now 9 years old, and it's still, at least as far as the price and the overall feature set, it is still the premium lens in the class at this point on Fuji X mount. But considering some of the evolving standards during that time, does this lens still hold up? It's definitely the most expensive option available. You're going to pay about $1,100 US for this lens. The Fuji 18 to 55 millimeter F2.8 to 4 OIS, it runs about $700 US. That compares to the Tamron 17 to 70 millimeter F2.8. It also has image stabilization. It is $700 US. And then the Sigma 18 to 50 millimeter F2.8 DM, it runs anywhere between $500 to $550. So basically about half the price of this lens. So this lens is obviously, it is large, it is heavy, it is expensive, but is it still the worthy option on the newer, higher resolution bodies? We're going to dive into that and find out in today's review.
Today's episode is brought to you by Fantom Wallet, the minimalist modern wallet that is now even better with the new Fantom X that is crafted from aluminum right here in Canada. It is 22% smaller and 35% lighter, while still making it easy to access your cards and money when you need them, thanks to their unique fanning mechanism. You could even customize your wallet due to its modular design, with accessories like a money clip, cash holder, ID display, and even Chipolo and AirTag tracking integration. Visit store.fantomwallet.com to check out their unique sizes, styles, and finishes that span from aluminum to wood to carbon fiber, and use code DUSTIN15 for 15% off when you're ready to check out.
Now, it's not my intent to completely redo my review here today, and if you want my original findings and a little more detail on various aspects of build and performance, you can check out my original review in either video or text form. Those will be linked here. This lens has a focal length that is the full frame comparison of 24 millimeters wide in to 84 millimeters on full frame. And so it goes from wide to a decent amount of telephoto. A very, very useful focal range. I will mention that in many ways is still the most compelling, though, obviously Tamron 17 to 70 millimeter also has an argument there. As far as the size, this is easily the largest lens in this class. It is 83.3 millimeters in diameter with a pretty large 77 millimeter front filter thread. It is 106 millimeters in length. That's 3.28 inches by 4.17 inches. And it weighs in at a whopping 655 grams, or right under 1.5 pounds. That's 370 grams more than the Sigma, which does have a slightly smaller zoom range, but shares the same maximum aperture throughout that zoom range. So obviously this lens is very arguably larger than what it needs to be at this point. Now, looking at this lens as far as Fuji's design language, the new lenses really don't look all that different than this. So Fuji has kept a consistent design language and has kept a consistent feature set. Now, I have a bit of an issue with that because I think with the evolving of hybrid type cameras like the XH2 that are amazing also as video cameras, I think that Fuji needs to evolve their design of their lenses to be a little bit more cognizant of the fact that people are using them for video, which I do find that to be a limitation with Fuji's lens designs. But on the positive side here, though this lens is 9 years old, it doesn't really feel all that different than what we're seeing currently coming from Fuji at this point. Now, the R and the WR in the name stands for, R stands for ring or aperture ring, which it does have an aperture ring here. And then the WR refers to the fact that it does have weather resistance or weather sealing. And so that's not just a gasket at the lens mount, but some internal seals as well. And so it kind of retains that positive premium standard there. Now, I will note that I don't know that time has been overly kind to the copy of the lens that Fuji Canada loaned me, and thanks to them for the loan, to evaluate here. The clicks are really, really strongly defined. And obviously, as I've already alluded to, there are no video-focused ideas when it comes to the aperture ring, so there's no D-click option. You're not going to be able to do anything like aperture racking because it doesn't move smoothly at all. But what it does allow you to do is to have clearly defined detents for the 1/3 stops in the aperture range from f2.8 to f22, and then also the option to put it into an automatic mode and control it from within the camera. Now, the manual focus ring itself has a decent feel to it, but what I really note with these older Fuji lenses is that manual focus is very much a matter of steps. I mean, literally, I could do almost like little clicks if I was trying to bring something into focus because it's not a smooth focus at all, but very much just one kind of step after another. So it's not exactly a refined or fun manual focus experience at all. And so I find that doing precision manual focus is basically only possible if you're kind of following those tiny steps. It's not a smooth process. And so again, there's some areas where the age of the lens shows up when it compares to modern design. Now, another positive that does pop up here, however, is the fact that back when I evaluated the lens on the X-T3, this was before Fuji was starting to roll out image stabilization in their cameras, in-body image stabilization. And so this lens had kind of a serious deficiency compared to, say, the 18-55mm that had the optical image stabilization built in. And so either you kind of got the premium build of this lens and the constant f2.8 aperture, or you had to choose to go with the smaller lens that had a variable aperture but did give you image stabilization. I found that in using I used actually 3 lenses on this trip. I used the Sigma, and by the way, I will do a comparison video between how the Sigma compares to both the 18-55 and the 16-55, so watch for that. But what I found using all 3 of these lenses side by side is that I really didn't see any difference between the non-image stabilized lenses and the lens that did have the optical stabilization. They behaved basically equally because of the inclusion now of the optical stabilization in the camera body. And that was true for either video or stills. So that's no longer really a disadvantage so long as you own one of now Fuji's many cameras that do have image stabilization built into the camera body itself. So let's talk about the autofocus performance for a moment. This is another area where I'm kind of interested in to see how an older lens holds up in the modern standard. And so what I found, again, is a bit of a mixed bag. There are some good areas, there's some not so good areas. So this has Fuji's linear motor, which is a higher powered focus motor. That's positive, obviously. It is quieter and smoother than some of the more buzzy micro motor designs. And what I found is that for the most part, autofocus holds up pretty well when it comes to stills. We'll come back to video in just a moment. You can see here from the autofocus pulls that they're fairly quick. The only way I kind of see some of the age is that there's a bit of a double clutch. You kind of focus 95% of the way. There's like a little bit of a pause and then the finish of the focus. And I did see that sometimes. You can definitely see it in my optical test, more indoors than outdoors. But you can also see here that it does, obviously image tracking was not really a Fuji technology when this lens was released, or really in the last time I did my review. You can see, however, now that on the XH2, it does a good job of staying locked onto one eye even as I move the camera around. I also found on the positive for the video front is that autofocus pulls were fairly quick and confident. There's a minimal amount of focus breathing. I did this test about middle of the range, somewhere around 27, 28 millimeters, and you can see that there's not really an issue there. I also noted that my hand test, that result was fine. So if I was just doing the control test, it wouldn't look so bad. But the problem is I used it quite a bit out in the real world. And what I found out in the real world is that there is a serious issue with focus just not settling in real world shots. And you can see, for example, in the shot of the flags up above, you can just see there's a pulsing in and out of focus. In the shot of the harbor in Charleston, you can see again that focus just doesn't stay confident and locked on. Now there's other clips where focus looked fine and stayed fine, but obviously I would say probably about 40 to 45% of my video clips were in some ways marred, even ruined by focus not being consistent. So I don't feel like the autofocus is fully reliable for the video side of things. It's an area where it's showing some age, that this was a lens that maybe wasn't designed with video in mind in the same way that modern cameras and lenses are designed around. So that's another area where it shows a bit of its age. The biggest thing, however, and the real reason why we're here, is that the optical standard has vastly changed. Obviously, there was the step up at around the X-T3 time to the 26 megapixels that I last tested this on from the previous 24 megapixel. So there was that shift to X-Trans, and of course now there is the shift to the 40 megapixel sensor like is in my XH2. And I have found that it is an incredibly demanding platform that, frankly, a lot of the older Fuji lenses just don't rise to the challenge on. They tend to look rather soft on it. Now, looking back at the original MTF chart, you can see that it is more consistent on the wide end than what it is on the telephoto end. And we're going to see that really kind of gets magnified on the XH2. Now, as far as some of the other kind of issues, which I've covered before, there is some significant barrel distortion, about a plus 22 to correct for on the wide end. Vignette is much more moderate. I only used a plus 49 to correct for it, so under 2 stops. I also found that fringing continues to be well controlled. Even when there's more pixels and so thus more potential to see fringing, I really didn't see it there. And so I have no complaints when it comes to either longitudinal or lateral chromatic aberrations. I feel like that is something that has held up well over the last 9 years. I also feel like on the wide end, the lens does quite good. Both when I tested at 16 millimeters and then the next marked zoom point on the zoom range is 23 millimeters. At both of those metrics, I feel like the lens performed quite well. And I'll show you a breakdown in the future comparison to the Sigma, for example, and then to the 18-55. And there's some give and take, but it's about in range with that lens. But starting at about 30 millimeters, I really noted a decline in performance to where if I was reviewing this as a new lens, I would be disappointed. I found that at 35 and then at 55 millimeters that the lens is just noticeably softer and doesn't really improve that much when stopped down. And that really echoed what I saw out in the real world. I get spoiled sometimes because the LCD and the viewfinder on the XH2 are really great. And so a lot of times images look pretty good here. So I'm reviewing them and I have a positive feel. And then I go and I review them on a big monitor, my 4K monitor, and review them at a higher magnification, and I'm much less impressed. And that was definitely the case here. I was actually really disappointed by how soft some of my real world shots were, basically anywhere past about 25 millimeters. And I just didn't love the results past 25 millimeters. I would take the Sigma 18-50 or the Tamron 17-70 millimeter any day when it comes to the telephoto end of the zoom range here. I also found that the bokeh quality in some situations looks good, basically when there's not bright specular highlights. When there is bright specular highlights, there's some really odd effects that I'll show you in the optical breakdown at the end of the video here. On the positive side of things, colors still look really fantastic, and the overall look of images looks really, really great. And so, again, my initial reaction looking at the back of the camera, looking in the viewfinder, it's like, okay, these images look fantastic. This lens is still holding up. And so globally, looking at them, images still look great. Fuji's color is great, and Fuji's glass produces really nice color. And so the overall look of the images, I'm very happy with. It's more when I do any kind of pixel peeping that I'm really disappointed with. And I was particularly disappointed for people type shots, when you tend to be zoomed in towards the telephoto range a little bit more. And it just did not hold up at all. So I would say that the small, inexpensive Sigma 18 to 50 millimeter, it best it in a number of optical metrics at this point. So my conclusion is this. It is kind of hard to justify the size and the price of the XF 16 to 55 millimeter on today's market, particularly if you're shooting with the higher resolution 40 megapixel camera. I had the newer Fuji 56mm f1.2 along with me as well on this trip, and I was reminded of just how much better Fuji's recent premium lenses are. You can tell that they're designed with this higher resolution point in mind, and it really shows. The images just sparkle in a way that they frankly don't with the 16 to 55 millimeter, along with a lot of the older lenses from Fuji. So I would say that both the autofocus and the optics are showing their age a bit, and it is time for a refresh. At the same time, if you already own this lens and you love it already, there's a reason why you own and you love it, and that is because it does produce beautiful images. They just don't hold up quite as well when you hold the magnifier of the modern camera and modern standards to it. But if you have this lens already and you love it, don't be discouraged by this review. Continue to love it, continue to love the images that you get. But if you're currently shopping right now, I would say wait. Either go for something like the Sigma 18 to 50 millimeter f2.8 and save yourself a ton of money, or wait until Fuji invariably replaces this lens with a newer design. Because if you're shooting with one of the newer cameras, I think that you're going to be disappointed in what you get for the amount of money that you spend here. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you want more information, you can check out my original reviews in the description down below. There's also buying links there if you'd like to purchase one. And now if you want to see what I'm referring to in detail when it comes to the optical performance on 40 megapixel, let's dive in together.
So we'll start by taking a look at vignette and distortion. Obviously, this is not something that's necessarily going to change with higher resolution, but just to revisit, since before I did it back in the day before my current test chart. You can see with corrections turned off that there is a significant amount of barrel distortion and a moderate amount of vignette in the corners. Now, while the best way to correct that is going to be through the built-in correction profiles, if you need to manually correct it, which I've done here to give us a look at what's actually being corrected, you'll see a plus 22. That mostly straightens things out, but you will see just a little bit of a mustache pattern that remains. Vignette is plus 48. So in the extreme corners, that's right under 2 stops, and so not terrible. Certainly for a lens like this, that's not bad on the vignette front, but the amount of barrel distortion that there is significant. Now, when it comes to fringing, I thought that was actually reasonably well controlled here, and still continues to be the case. You can see that on the letters here, there's not really any fringing as we go out of focus. You can see on these various lights that I've got inserted here that in the bright areas, there's no fringing around that. And as we transition towards the defocused area, you can see likewise there's very, very little fringing that's there. Unfortunately, what you can see is definitely a fair bit more outlining and kind of some busyness in some of the bokeh highlights, much more than what I would prefer. Swapping things around with a little bit in the foreground here, you can see that, again, we have no real fringing showing up there. And as we look at the reflective surfaces here on the old bellows camera there, you can see it looks pretty good. Everything's holding up quite well. Now here's where things get tough, and that is, how does this now 9-year-old lens perform on Fuji's modern 40 megapixel sensors? I examined these results at 200%. You can see that at 16 millimeters in the center of the frame, it's not bad. We got good resolution and detail there. It's not mind-blowingly good, but certainly not bad. Looking at the mid-frame, also fairly good. And over in the corner, it is okay. Looking at the other side, you can see that the centering's not perfect on this copy. It's definitely softer on this corner than what it is over on the left side, where it looks pretty good up in that corner. Now, if we stop down to f4 in the center of the frame, we see that, if anything, it actually looks a little bit less sharp in the center of the frame. That's not true elsewhere, however. Interestingly, we can see that the mid-frame here, it looks a little bit crisper, and up into this left corner, you can definitely see a little bit of improved contrast and detail. Even if we pop down to this corner where it is softer to begin with, you can see that it's a little bit sharper there. And so, interestingly, it's only the center that's softer. That trend continues here at f5.6. You can see that there really isn't any improvement in the center of the frame. However, if we look elsewhere, again, about equal up into this corner. Roughly the same, but I would say that f4 maybe looks a little bit than f5.6. Up in this corner, you can see that things are about equal. And down in this corner, I would say there's a little bit of improvement at f5.6 versus f4. Now, something that is a much bigger factor now on 40 megapixels versus the 26 megapixel sensor I previously reviewed the lens on is that diffraction hits both earlier and harder with the 40 megapixel sensor. So you can see that by f11, image is definitely starting to soften a bit. By f22, which is minimum aperture, it is severely softened. And even in the places where the lens has looked the best before, you can see that it is much more noticeably soft now when you get down to f22. Now, the next marked position on the lens is 23 millimeters. It's communicated here as 22 millimeters, but you can see looking here that the center of the frame looks largely the same as what we saw before. Stopping down to f4 on the right, not really any improvement, kind of the same pattern that we saw previously. Now, if you move off center, interestingly, the lens definitely sharpens up at f4, and so there's definitely more of an improvement in the mid frame and into the corners versus the improvement in the center of the frame. And moving up into this corner here, you can see that there's a very noticeable improvement by f4, a little bit more improvement by f5.6, as you can see here. But due to diffraction between f5.6 and f8, you'll find that diffraction is starting to introduce just a little bit of softness into the image, and obviously that pattern will continue as we saw before. Now, at 35 millimeters, we can see a more noticeable improvement in the center of the frame when stopped down. We can also see that there is definitely less contrast in the center of the frame at f2.8 wide open relative to what we've seen previous to this point. That low contrast is visible here in the mid frame. You can see a little bit of improvement when we're stopped down to f4 and into the corners. Corners looking quite soft here. A little bit improved by by f4. We pop up to the upper corner, which this lens tends to be, at least this copy tends to be stronger there. We can see that it's somewhat improved by f4, but definitely not as sharp as what we've seen previously. Stopping down to f5.6 really doesn't make much of an improvement over f4. Taking a look a few other places, I would say it's very, very slightly more contrasty in that zone. And here we can see that it's really about equal, not really any improvement. If anything, a mild step back at f5.6. So we can see that 35 millimeters definitely not as sharp as what we saw at either 16 or 23 millimeters. Now, fortunately, there is some bounce back at 55 millimeters. Contrast is still not fantastic, but you can see that there's definitely a little bit more contrast in detail in the center of the frame at 55 millimeters than what we saw at 35 millimeters. We don't really see much of an improvement at f4 in the center, however. In the mid-frame, we can see also that stopping down is not making any kind of improvement. Up here in the corner, we see the same is true. Looking at the other corner, same story there. Stopping on down to f5.6 makes a very slight improvement, but you can see here that the corners are never really all that sharp. And even the mid frame actually is starting to regress a little bit and just is not nearly as sharp as what I would like at f5.6. It really doesn't get that sharp anywhere here. And you can see that ironically in the center of the frame, it's definitely looking softer as the lens is stopped down from f4 to f5.6. Unfortunately, this also is consistent with what I saw in real-world results. What I found in real-world situations is that my impression of the lens performance really varied from image to image. This image here, you can see that even at f2.8, while contrast isn't off the page, you can see that everything looks fairly good here all throughout the frame. Even towards the corners, they look quite good. Now this shot is also at 16 millimeters, except for now we're at f5.6. The lighting is really good here, so this is an image that should pop, and frankly, it looks fairly good. You can see the detail here is, if not, off the charts good, it's certainly good enough that the image is very usable. This shot also at 16 millimeters, and again, I find that it's holding up okay. The detail is fine here, and as we look towards even the edge of the frame, again, contrast isn't amazing, but everything is reasonably good here and sharp throughout the frame. Unfortunately, when the lens is zoomed in a bit, however, I was much less happy with my results. And so here a portrait shot of some friends, and you can just see that contrast and sharpness is really not great. The lens just looks a bit soft here with more of a center composition, and this is at f5.6. Here's a shot at around 36 millimeters, f2.8, and while the image is cute in its general appearance, you can see that if we look in at a pixel level, it's really not super sharp. There's just not a lot of detail or delineation there. This shot at 44 millimeters, you can see it looks fine again looking at a global level. But again, if we look in at a pixel level, I'm really unhappy with the overall sharpness and contrast of this image. It just looks a bit soft. Now going back to around 18 millimeters here, you can see that results are much better. And so detail is good once again. So I like this lens fine on the wide end, but once you get past about 25 to 30 millimeters, it really softens up badly on this high resolution body. Now on the positive note, you can see that the colors are looking really rich. And so I like the look of images, writ large. I just didn't like them so much at a pixel level. Now, the 18 to 55 millimeter has ever so slightly higher magnification in my test, but I did find that the 16 to 55 millimeter held up better up close. And so you can see there's a decent amount of contrast and detail there. And so it did a better job up close than what that lens did. I also felt like the color rendition continued to be really exceptionally nice from the lens. That's something that Fuji glass does really well, and so I could definitely tell a difference. It still holds up really well in that regard. Here with a circular polarizer, you can see that the colors really pop on there nicely, and so everything stands out in fine detail. And you can see here again, because we're shooting at the wider end of the zoom range, you can see that the detail is holding up nicely throughout the building and throughout the image in general. One final shot to illustrate this, again with the polarizer on there. I love the pop of the whites versus the blue. Again, the Fuji glass is really nice for colors. And we can see here that, again, it's not pen sharp throughout, but at wider focal lengths, it looks fine. I mean, detail is good, certainly usable. There's plenty of information there all throughout the image. I also like the performance a little bit better when it comes to flare resistance on the wide end than on the telephoto end. And so you can see in the wider shot here that there's just a little bit less of the ghosting artifacts. And as we look at the telephoto end, you can just see that there's a little bit more veiling and a little bit more loss of contrast there shooting into the sun. Here's another shot on the beach here, and you can see again the at a wider angle of view, there's just a little bit of localized flare artifacts there, but for the most part, contrast has held up fine and the image looks good.
You've made it to the very end. Thanks to those of you that are faithful and are sticking around to hear me say, have a great day and let the light in.